2, 1, 2. Testing 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Audio test 1, 2. Sound check 1, 2. Line level out. The levels are looking good. They're dancing around and stuff. Okay.
Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the World Affairs Council of Washington, I'd like to welcome you all here this evening to the Council's annual policy panel discussion with foreign editors and correspondents of the Washington Post. My name is Heidi Shoup, and I'm the president of the Council, and I can tell you that this event is one of the most popular annual programs that we have, and we are very appreciative of the Post's efforts to work with us each year to put together this event. What a terrific group of speakers we have with us this evening to discuss America and the World 2008. As a group, our speakers have reported from Asia, Europe, Central and South America, and of course the Middle East and South Asia, where so much of America's foreign policy attention has been focused in recent years. In addition to our public policy forums, the Council sponsors a number of educational programs in cooperation with the high schools in the Washington metropolitan area. One of these programs, the Council's Young Journalist program, invites high school journalist students and their teachers to attend foreign policy events such as this and interview the speakers prior to the program. Tonight we are pleased to have with us students from Coeus International High School here in the district and from West Potomac High School in Virginia. I would like to thank Verizon Wireless, this evening's sponsor, and I urge you to stop by their representatives' table outside in the lobby this evening and learn more about their services. And speaking of wireless, I will remind you all at this time to turn off any wireless devices you might have as a courtesy to our panel and to your fellow audience. Our moderator this evening is Leonard Downey, Jr., executive editor of the Washington Post, a position he has held since September of 1991, after serving as managing editor for 7 years. He worked on the Metropolitan staff as a reporter and editor for 15 years and ran the staff as assistant managing editor for Metropolitan News from 1974 until 1979. As deputy Metropolitan editor, he helped supervise the Post's Watergate coverage. He was named London correspondent in 1979 and returned to Washington in '82 as national editor. In '84, he became managing editor, and he is also director of the Los Angeles Times Washington News Service. I will leave it to him to introduce his colleagues, so please join me in welcoming Leonard Downey, Jr. and our distinguished panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to see the students here tonight along with everyone else. This is one of our favorite events of the year because it's always such an attentive and well-informed audience, and we will really appreciate your questions after each of our panelists has spoken for about 5 to 10 minutes. That's 5 to 10 minutes, members of the panel. So we have plenty of time left for questions since we're supposed to end sometime shortly after 8 o'clock. Covering international news remains a very, very important priority for the Washington Post. Even as we, along with other journalistic organizations, have to tighten up on expenses in the age of the internet in which our business models are changing quite drastically, foreign news remains extremely important to both our local audience here in Washington, the Washington Post print newspaper audience, which of course includes a lot of international workers here in Washington, and 1 out of every 6 people in the Washington area is born in another country, which increases their interest in international news from many different countries of origin. But also for our website, WashingtonPost.com, which has millions of readers around the country and around the world, and for them our international coverage is also extremely important. And of course, one of the most important and expensive and worrying stories that we cover is the war in Iraq. We're one of the few American newspapers to maintain a full-service bureau still in Iraq because of both the great cost and the incredible security issues involved in working in that country. We have a bureau that has a basic 3 American correspondents and 1 photographer at the moment, and other correspondents, including our Defense Pentagon correspondents here in Washington and others, rotate through for various purposes. We have a staff of more than 3 dozen Iraqis. Some of them are reporters, translators, people who help keep up our bureau compound there, and security guards, because we have elaborate security arrangements there to keep our correspondents safe. Unfortunately, last year we lost one of our Iraqi colleagues, one of our favorite colleagues, who was shot while out taking photographs for the Washington Post in a neighborhood in Iraq. Amit Paley is one of our correspondents there now. Amit began on the Metro staff of the Washington Post, as did I, which is always nice to see. And he's now joined the foreign staff in Baghdad. Does a really outstanding job there, and will now tell you the latest of what's going on in the war there. Amit?
Well, I'm sure the question that all of you have is the same one I'm always asked whenever I come back from Iraq, and that's how are things going there? And depending on someone's political perspective, are we winning the war there? And are things getting better? That's obviously an important question in the political arena right now, and also one of the most difficult questions to answer. I guess I'd offer a little bit of my personal experiences there. I first went to Iraq in 2006. And when I was there, it was right at some of the worst parts of the violence after the bombing of the Samara Mosque. The sentiment there was that things were very, very bad and only going to get worse. And I left right at the end of 2006, right before the surge began. And I was gone for almost all of 2007, returning right when the effects of the surge were beginning to bear fruit, when things were starting to get better. And I actually arrived right about at the moment where that was really becoming clear, which was a big surprise, I think, to a lot of people in Iraq, the press corps, but also people on the ground who thought they were in the middle of a cycle of violence that was only going to get worse and going to continue to become something terrible. Some feared, some threw out the word genocide even, and depending on your perspective, was or going to descend into a civil war. So it was really, really a big surprise for me to arrive in Baghdad in October of October of 07, after a year gone, and see a lot of improvements on the ground. There are a lot of disputes about numbers and statistics, and everyone knows that those can be twisted and used in different ways and often conflict. But one thing that I thought was very telling was the sense of actual Iraqis in Baghdad in particular who said that it was getting safer. And we did a number of stories on the lives of Iraqis, how they were being affected and impacted. And the fact that they felt that Iraq was safer and that Baghdad in particular was safer really gave an indication that at least violence-wise, things were improving. So the simple answer for a lot of people might be, well, things are getting better. But to go from my personal experience, the day after I arrived in Iraq was the day a colleague and friend of mine, Saleh Saif al-Din, was killed. So at the same time as you're seeing overall decrease in violence from some of the worst moments, some of the most devastating moments, there is still obviously a very high level of violence, and I think that's been very difficult to explain to the public, how you can talk about things getting better and at the same time the level of violence and the living conditions for average Iraqis being so difficult to fathom for people, what it means to not be able to walk on the streets in your neighborhood, being afraid of calling the police, not being able to call the police, being afraid of hospitals, being afraid of being killed there to go for treatment if you happen to be a victim of an attack. So I think those conflicting strains are very difficult to explain, and all the facets of success that are being seen right now in terms of the buildup of U.S. troops, known as the surge, in terms of groups known either as the Awakening Councils, the Sahwa in Arabic, which are groups of mainly Sunnis, many of whom were members of al-Qaeda in Iraq, and were Sunni insurgents who have now turned against the insurgency and are fighting with American troops. That's been a big success so far, but that many people fear could turn at any moment and create worse levels of violence than existed in the past. So trying to balance all those different things, seeing signs of success, but also fearing that within those signs of success are the seeds of potential failure, is really difficult to gauge. And I think even as people try to determine what's going to happen in 2009 and whether change in administration will dramatically impact the war, there's a lot of uncertainty right now about whether or not even what's happening right now will continue to see success, or whether there's beginning to be fraying of those signs. So I think that's the most difficult thing right now to explain to people. I think in terms of when you talk to average Iraqis, when I talk to a lot of them right now, there's a sense of concern about what's going to happen in the future about American politics. Obviously, Americans are focused on that right now. Iraqis are still only have a vague sense of what's going on, but there is a lot of concern about what the withdrawal of further American troops will have. There's a very stark sense, particularly within the Iraqi government, about how different an administration of President McCain versus President Obama and even President Clinton would look to Iraq. I think that while there is now a growing sense of commitment from a lot of the Iraqi government to standing with Americans and wanting that support, a lot of them are concerned about whether that support is going to be abandoned. So they're a very confusing set of emotions, because at the same time that a lot of the groups of people that at the beginning of the war were firmly anti-American are now turning to the Americans and reliant on the Americans, talking about particularly the Sunni population, are relying upon them for our support. So it's a fascinating time to be there, one in which there aren't really any easy answers, which is always a source of disappointment, but I'm sure that you'll have questions and be glad to answer any of the specific questions you have about what life is like in Iraq and some of the specific issues that we touched on that I'm sure you might have questions about.
So I can just ask you one thing to explain right now, Amit. Can you tell people how you go about covering things in the country, considering the security issues?
Well, it's very difficult. Whenever we move around, we travel with security, we travel with bodyguards, we travel with and usually in armored cars, and usually with a chase car. There have been sections of the country that have just been off limits, places that you can't go. That is now beginning to change, and there are now areas of the country and areas of Baghdad where we haven't been in quite a while that we're beginning to try out and see if they're safe. But that's obviously a very difficult thing to assess, that someone might decide that it's safe for one person to go there and not for another. And how do you decide a place that's been dangerous, a place that's been thought of as a no-go zone, how do you decide that is now a place that you can go? So it's a constant balancing act, and one in which the stakes are obviously very high, not just when Western correspondents to go somewhere, we don't go by ourselves, we're going with a lot of Iraqi lives, so we have to weigh a lot of concerns, not just our own, but also our friends and colleagues who are going with us. So that's, I think, one of the more challenging ones. But I think if the security improvements continue, that you'll begin to see reporting. They'll be reporting from more parts of the country where previously we might have only gone embedded with American troops. We might now be going unilaterally, and hopefully that will improve our reporting and give more facets of what's going on in Iraq than we've been able to do in the past.
And Scott, are you able to say anything about the interview that we had with General Petraeus over there today, to add to that?
We were able to speak with General Petraeus today, and he gave us some sense of what he might tell Congress next month. The focus of his remarks are largely that while the surge in U.S. troops has brought some peace and calm to Baghdad in particular, and other areas, and including the arrangements that have been made with the Sunni awakening tribes and with the Shiite militia of Muqtada al-Sadr, that while there has been some calm and peace, the Iraqi politicians have not taken advantage of that to pass legislation and to reconcile themselves across sectarian lines, which was essentially part two of what the surge was supposed to produce. And so he was both optimistic about the security situation at the moment, but disappointed by the lack of political progress that the Iraqi leadership has been able to make.
Scott's our foreign editor now, and you'll hear from him later. The next one, introduce Pam Constable, who's just a remarkable journalist. who is currently supposedly on the Metro staff of the Washington Post, where she does a really good job of helping to cover the various immigrant communities in the Washington area, among other things she does. But she also frequently continues to travel back to South Asia, where she had worked for many years as a correspondent in Kabul and New Delhi, to do special assignments in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. And of course, as you know, the other war is going on in Afghanistan and to some extent in parts of Pakistan. And Pam, based on what she's picked up in her most recent travels, will be able to bring you up to date on the situation there.
I'll stand here because even despite the mics, I'm often hard to hear and see. And I'll talk fast because I have 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you. As Len said, I recently returned from a trip to Pakistan and Afghanistan, where I've been returning frequently for a number of years. And I thought I would talk tonight about Pakistan because I think a lot of you know that there was a major election there in February, and the events there have been especially riveting in recent months. We can talk about Afghanistan as well. If you have questions, that's also great, but I thought I'd focus my remarks on Pakistan for the moment. There's, of course, good news and bad news. The bad news is that for Pakistan, this past year has been incredibly turbulent. A state of emergency was imposed. The now former military dictator fired essentially the entire Supreme Court. There was a consistent rise in suicide bombings, a continued rise in Islamic militancy and violent Islamic militancy in many parts of the country. A great deal of domestic repression going on, repression of the press, as well as the courts and other institutions. At the same time, this steadily encroaching threat of Islamic militancy in the Afghan-Pakistan area. So it's been a very difficult time for Pakistan in the past year. But miraculously, for all of us, including those who had to cover it, there was a quite successful election on February 18th. Everybody thought that there was going to be massive rigging at the polls, and everybody thought this was going to occasion terrible rioting in the streets and chaos to follow. Instead, for some mysterious reason, everything went more or less okay by third world standards. It was a relatively orderly vote. It was peaceful. People voted. I went to half a dozen or maybe 10 polling places. My colleagues went to others. There were some foreign observers. We didn't see anything amiss. Everyone we met was doing their job. And more important, when it turned out that the ruling party, the party that was allied with President Musharraf and former military dictator Musharraf, had lost very badly, the head of that party very quickly and very graciously accepted defeat. To me, that's the definition of democracy right there. You had people in a position to do a lot of harm who instead accepted the results of an election without a lot of difficulty. So that's very good news. I would also say that from a Western point of view, although I don't like to make this point too simplistically, the fact that I don't like to use the word secular, but the fact that the non-Islamic parties came out ahead in that election, that basically the non-Islamic opposition won that election. This is what we would say is the closest equivalent to the kinds of parties that we have in this country. And of course, the fact that Benazir Bhutto's party did so well, and that her widower, who's now the head of that party, was able to form an alliance with that party's longtime arch rival, the Nawaz Sharif and his Muslim League party. That's really a very big advance. Bhutto's assassination, in some ways, I think, was the key to having that election work. The country was really in shock. And I think it's fair to say that almost everybody, including the military, including people from all parties, felt that We can't allow this to fall apart. We can't allow this series of tragic events and bombings and assassinations to add up to something that's really going to destroy our country. Many people were afraid that it was going to. So I think that, in a sad way, may have made a real difference. Unfortunately, Pakistan still faces all the problems it faced on February 17th. Tremendous poverty, tremendous illiteracy, great alienation from the state. Most young people grow up in Pakistan. It's a country of 160 million people, with no hope for the future, with very little access to education or work of any kind. And so they turn to religious parties. They turn to, in increasing cases, religious fundamentalism, violent Islamic extremist groups. That threat is very much still there. Now, one of the other pieces of good news that happened in that election was up in the Northwest, which is the most religiously and tribally conservative region of the country. The Islamic parties, which had been in power there for 5 years, were soundly defeated by the same people who'd voted them in. Now, I don't want to imply that that means a rejection of Islam. Far from it. This is a very conservative Muslim country. But basically they were saying, these guys didn't do a good job governing, so we want to give someone else a chance. Again, very good news, but not a rejection of the beliefs and the faith, a rejection of bad governance, which is really what it ought to be all about. Again, a positive sign. But what you have now is a situation of relative calm, except that you still have this constant threat of terrorism from the fundamentalist groups. You have suicide bombings continuing, happening in places they've never happened before, including the city of Lahore, the cultural capital of Pakistan. There have been a series of suicide bombings there in the past few weeks. Up in the Northwest, which is a very traditional tribal area, there have been a number of suicide bombings at things like weddings and funerals and tribal meetings, which means that the bad guys are going after their own people in a very vicious way. And that, again, is also very disturbing. I think the question that I'd like to leave you with, because it's, of course, the one you all want to think about and discuss, is, what can we do to help shore up democracy in a country like Pakistan that's been sort of on the brink for so long and now does seem to have a chance? And I would argue that that the best policy for our leaders and for us and for the West, and for democracies in the West, is to do whatever we can to try to shore up what I would call the moderate Islamic center. The more we can do that, however we can do that, the more chance there is to keep the radical extremists on the fringes and to keep those who really want violence on the fringes. And I would recommend that you all read Benazir Bhutto's book, which she wrote in the last days before she was killed, and which is basically a very passionate call to those in the West, as well as to her own country people. And she says, look, Islam is my religion. I may have gone to Oxford, I may have gone to Harvard, I may speak perfect English, but I'm a Muslim too. This is my religion, and I'm afraid it's being hijacked by people who do not believe what I do and who believe in violent solutions to problems. So, her appeal spoke to me, and I think it spoke to many readers, and I agree with what she said. Thank you.
Pam, before you go, can I ask you just one quick question? You mentioned how poor Pakistan is. When we witness the economic miracle going on in much of India, why is Pakistan left behind?
It's a very good question that many people have been grappling with for a long time. There are several explanations. I would say, Indian democracy is one of the great miracles of the world. The fact that even though it's a very poor country, not unlike Pakistan in that sense, the people feel they can peacefully and fairly participate in the governance and leadership of their country. It makes a huge difference about the way people feel towards their country and about the commitment they have to it. The other thing is that because India has opened up so much to the world in the past a couple of decades. It's just leaped ahead of Pakistan because it hasn't been bogged down in religious issues and militancy issues. It's been able to take off in ways that Pakistan hasn't. I think it's a more tolerant society, it's a more open society, and that has really contributed greatly to its economic growth and health.
Thanks.
Sure.
Anthony Shadid is probably the leading journalistic expert on the part of the world we've been discussing tonight. He's, ever since September 11, 2001, he's reported for the Washington Post from various locations in the Middle East, including Egypt, Syria, Israel, and Palestine. And he had been in that part of the world previously with the Boston Globe before he came to us. In March of 2003, Anthony went to Iraq and remained in Baghdad before the invasion, during the invasion, and after the American invasion, reporting particularly what was happening to the Iraqi people during the early parts of this long war. And he won the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting. And the second of his books was about what he learned there too, called Night Draws Near, Iraq's People in the Shadows of America's War. It's always a great honor to introduce Anthony Shadid.
Thank you, Len. I appreciate that. And I have to say, compared to what I've been covering over the past few years, I feel a little embarrassed to be sharing the table with Amit right now. He's covering Iraq. I'm sitting in a rather idyllic village in southern Lebanon writing another book right now, and I can talk about picking olives or planting an orange tree called the Father of the Belly Button. As I realized I was going to have to talk to you all tonight about the Middle East, I thought, I thought I might not be all that qualified given that I'm working on a book mainly about nostalgia, memory, and loss. But then as I thought about it, I realized that, in fact, that might be the way to talk a little bit about the Middle East, maybe try to say something different. I don't think I'm going to speak about policy per se, if I can, over these next 5 or 10 minutes, but maybe something that I feel is almost changing the fabric of the Middle East in some ways. Like I said, I'm in this village right now. What I'm doing is I'm rebuilding my family's ancestral home in southern Lebanon, and I'm telling their story of their departure from that home. And through those two narratives, I'm trying to find out if we can ever regain what was lost. It's an interesting village, I have to say. Most of the people in the village think I'm completely insane for building a house that's about a mile from the Israeli border. I still have the sneaking suspicion that I'm going to put the last stone on the house and a bomb's going to fall on it. The village itself is a little nutty, I have to say, and I think it says something about Lebanon. If I can just share a quick anecdote about that. There's a friend of mine. He's a Protestant. He's a Protestant. And now Lebanon's it's almost a cliche of how diverse Lebanon is. It's a country of 18 religious sects. This was during the war, the Civil War, and he got stopped at a Muslim checkpoint that was run by Palestinians, and the militiaman looked at his ID card and it said Protestant, and he's like, what is this Protestant? And he wasn't a Roman Catholic, which they were fighting. He wasn't a Greek Orthodox, which was the second biggest Christian group in Lebanon. And he shouts to his commander, he says, what do we do with this guy, this Protestant guy? Do we kill him? And he's like, no, leave him alone. They're fighting Catholics in Ireland. So, it's an interesting place, I have to say. And I think that kind of goes to what I wanted maybe to talk a little bit about, which is this town. And maybe I can use this town as a way to say something a little bit broader about what I think is going on in the Middle East. The town I'm in right now is called Judayt Marjayoun. It's a gorgeous town. It's right in the base of Mount Hermon, Jebel al-Sheikh. There's snow there right now. I just left a few days ago, and there was snow on the peaks of the mountain. It's hard to, I think, convey the beauty of the place. It's like describing the color of the leaves of an olive tree. There's nothing masculine about it. It has this really graceful and gentle quality. I have to say I've fallen in love with the place. 60 years ago, 70 years ago, it used to rival Beirut in size. It had 4 newspapers. The high schools there that taught English and French were the envy of the region. And for much of its history, it looked kind of beyond its locale to modern-day Israel, Jordan, Syria. It was a real hub for the region. Of course, Lebanon's modern history changed that. Borders got drawn in the 1920s when the French were there. 1948 led to the creation of Israel. The Civil War in Lebanon started in 1975. And today, this town that used to maybe be 10,000 people is perhaps 700 or 800 people. It still retains that diversity, that idea of having Protestants, Maronites, Orthodox, Sunnis, Shiites, Druze. They all live in this one very small area, probably a quarter the size of Washington. But that's about all it has left. I think when you walk through the village today, house after house is abandoned, including my grandparents' house. It had fallen apart when I started the rebuilding. And when I walk through Marjayoun these days, over the 6, 7, 8 months I've been spending there, I realize that it's dying. And I realize that it's not the only thing that I think is dying in the Middle East right now. And I think back to some of the other locales that Amit is familiar with. Mutanebi Street, for instance, in Baghdad, Abu Nawas. I think of Hamra Street in Beirut. I think of an old downtown of Cairo that was destroyed by fire and revolution. I think I see that the death of this village that I'm living in southern Lebanon is somewhat indicative of a transformation that's going on in the rest of the Arab world. Marjayoun it's a Greek Orthodox village. And I think its sectarian identity is only important to mention tonight just as a way of explaining that the politics of the place used to mirror the politics of the sect. A generation ago, 2 generations ago, maybe before the Civil War, everyone was basically a communist or a Syrian nationalist, a leftist party that is there. These days, as in those places I just mentioned, and as in Marjayoun, these ideologies have faded. Most of the party cadres have died or they've given up on politics. And everyone basically in this town is left with this notion of being Christian. That identification, I think, reinforces their minority status. And I think that specificity, the sense of identifying them in those terms, probably means their extinction. I don't think Marjayoun is going to be around in 20 years. I think I'm living in a town that has already begun its long autumn. I'm going to read I always want to I'm afraid I'm going to get this wrong, so I might try to read a little bit about what I'm trying to get at, what the death of Marjayoun means. When I walk around in the town, I realize that in a lot of ways there is no room left for this town that might have been somewhat tolerant, somewhat diverse, somewhat liberal even, a couple of generations ago. There's no room left for it in Lebanon. And it's sad for me to say that I don't think there's any room left in the Middle East for it. I think when we look at the Arab world today, it's a region that's organizing itself. It's organizing itself around this exclusive view of identity. Like I mentioned, there aren't secular movements anymore, the kind that once propelled the region forward. I think ideology has died in the Middle East, be it Arab nationalism, currents of the left, and so on. And whatever the successes or failures of those movements, and there are plenty of failures, it was hard to deny that in them, in these secular ideologies, there was a universality that I think transcended these parochial identities of the past. And that's just no longer the case. Politics are more and more reflected through an unyielding religious discourse or more primordial affiliations that break down along religious sect and ethnicity, as Sunni Muslims, as Shiite Muslims, as Christians, as Kurds, and so on. And I think lost in this is a notion of collective action, of uniting around principles or ideals. And in the end, I think what we're basically left with is tribes that are bereft of citizenship, that are sadly small. And each of these tribes comes away with an existential sense of itself, its very survival threatened by its own uniqueness. I was giving a talk last night at St. Lawrence University, and it was interesting. Someone said to me, if you were talking about what's the biggest change in the Middle East, or what's the biggest problem in the Middle East right now, and my first answer to that was that we don't realize the scope of the degradation or the deterioration that has happened in the Arab world, that an old order, basically an order that rose up after colonialism, has collapsed, and that we're stuck in an interregnum right now. We're stuck in an interregnum that I think could last for a long time. I think it could be brutal, violent, and very, very dangerous. That was my first reaction. But then I thought about it a little bit after I went home that night, and I realized that what I think is more important than that notion of an interregnum is that there is a very fundamental reformulation of identity going on in the Arab world. And I think this is a spectacular change. I think it's perhaps one of the most important changes in generations in the Middle East. What we're basically left with, I think, at the beginning of the Bush administration was this notion of trying to create a more democratic Middle East, a Middle East that had a civil society, a functioning civil society that was somewhat liberal, notions of tolerance, notions of, I don't think the Bush administration would have used this word, but this idea of cosmopolitanism. I think what we have today and what's gathering in the Middle East right now is the exact antithesis of that. I think what we've lost are those notions of liberalism, secularism, cosmopolitanism, and I feel that those forces are only gathering strength. It makes me sad to say that. I feel like the Middle East that I first started covering in 1995, I feel like the Middle East that I identified with as a younger man is being lost, and I'm not sure how to stop that loss.
Scott Wilson became the foreign editor of the Washington Post at the beginning of this year, after having worked on our Metro staff and then served for quite a while as a foreign correspondent. He most recently was also in the Middle East, covering Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Israel. But before that, he was a correspondent in Latin America, based in Bogota, Colombia. He covered the Caribbean and the Andes. And as you know, of course, the Latin America has become increasingly important again to Americans, a lot of what's going on there. And so tonight, Scott will talk about what's happening in Latin America.
Thanks, Len. The Middle East is dominating foreign policy discourse in this country these days, but if anyone needed any reminder of how important Latin America is to us still, they don't need to look any farther than just across the Rio Grande to places like Nuevo Laredo and Reynosa and Tijuana, where a true war is taking place right on our border. The government of Felipe Calderon has deployed army troops to cities in Mexico for the first time, 20,000 troops. You see scenes like Amit sees every day, and Anthony and I have seen, and Pam has seen in Iraq, with Humvees patrolling these streets against armies built by drug cartels that are using anti-tank weapons and the heavy firearms to take on the Mexican government. And it's drawing in the Bush administration that is now proposing a $500 million annual aid package to try to stop the deterioration of Mexican institutions and society that has been shaken by this violence. And then look all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, and where next week the Secretary of State is intentionally skipping a visit to Argentina because of that new government's increasingly close ties with Venezuela's Hugo Chavez. In between, you have a bewildering array of political changes taking place. You have a Latin American left that is now divided between European-style socialists, the president of Brazil may be one, to unreconstructed Marxists in Hugo Chavez and in Raul Castro, who the younger brother who just took over from Fidel. And this is a part of the world where every American administration says it plans to engage much more fully when they take office, and never seems to get around to it. And what is happening across this region, from migration from poor countries to slightly less poor countries, from a drug trade that is cruelest and strongest in the weakest places, to migration coming into our country at rates that alarm many people here, in environmental advances and in degradation, both in terms of developing ethanol, which Brazil is at the forefront of, and in having to manage its resources from a poor populations that are surrounded by these resources and depend on them for their livelihoods. It's a place that I traveled quite a bit through when I was there from 2000 to 2004. And where I lived in Bogota, Colombia, there have been great gains in security in particular. The government of President Uribe, with a great deal of billions of dollars in U.S. aid, has managed to improve that security situation hugely, but at a cost to civil society and human rights in that country. And these are the kinds of issues now that this administration, I believe, at one point intended to take on to some degree, and have been drowned out to what is happening in the Middle East. You have a real scaling back of ambitions and understanding at the same time of what is taking place in Latin America by we North Americans. We went from the ambitions of a free trade of the America zone that would capture everything from Canada down to Argentina, to now making very small bilateral trade deals with individual countries which are having trouble passing on their own for reasons of human rights and environmental regulation. And it's never ceased to amaze me the sort of misunderstandings that we have towards our closest neighbors about the way they perceive us, and have an inflated sense of our influence, and at the same time the way we continue to overlook a place that is extremely important, not only to our economics and demographics and politics increasingly, but also to the future of the way we will engage this part of the world. And so I'd like to talk to you as much as possible about that, just as an alternative to what is a debate in this country that has very much focused around the central part of conflict in the world right now in the Middle East, and where I've spent the last 3 years, almost 4 years. But it's a place that does need to be remembered, and especially with much of what's gathering along our borders right now.
Scott, could you explain the recent tensions amongst Colombia, Uruguay, and Venezuela, and is that, I know it's symbolic of sort of larger tensions, and is that going to get out of hand?
Very much so. You see across Latin America, you see both a greater intertwining of economies and cultures, and at the same time a rising sense of nationalism at the same time, which come in conflict, as we saw just this month. When Colombia went just inside Ecuadorian territory and killed a leader of the FARC. And this inflamed and was used to some degree by the anti-American leaders of Ecuador and Venezuela to mobilize troops to their border with Colombia, which they now see as very much a tool of American interests in Latin America. And the idea that Venezuelan or Ecuadorian tanks would roll into Colombia just seems so far-fetched, but it does illustrate very much the way that a lot of the old dynamics of Cold War politics still play out in this part of the world, and that there is very much a sense of Yankee imperialism embodied by the president of Colombia at this moment, and the leftism that is advocated by Hugo Chavez, which is itself very much a product of failed U.S.-backed governments that have siphoned off a great deal of natural resources, in Venezuela's case, the oil money, and to some degree in Ecuador the same, with U.S. oil companies working very much there in indigenous lands. And so these are the kinds of what seem to be very small episodes that can lead right now to very big differences and even conflict in a part of the world that it would seem very odd to have that kind of a standoff on its borders.
And after the failure of the referendum to make him president for life, is Chavez still on the upswing, do you think, or on the downside of the arc of his power in Venezuela?
Chavez has benefited for a couple of reasons. One, from U.S. foreign policy towards him that hasn't been as nuanced as it probably should be, and as well as a real dearth in talented opposition. What springs to mind for me is spending 6 weeks over a Christmas a few years ago during a general strike called by the opposition in Venezuela that absolutely bankrupted the middle class, which was essentially precisely the Chavez opposition and what he was looking for. So you had a very strategically challenged opposition and a very talented populist with quite a bit of material to work with in Chavez. He had years of bad government to draw on. But there is, as Len said, a referendum that would have concentrated more power in his hands, allowed him to continue to run for election, which he feels very confident in winning for some of the reasons I talked about. That will not happen. And so there is a turning of the tide to some degree. But he still is sort of the class of the show down there in terms of, and the changes he has made during his 8 years in power have reinforced his ability to hold on to that power to a great degree. But there is a loss to some degree in his popularity among the classes of people that once he could once count on wholeheartedly.
Okay, now this is your time of the program, the best time of the program that will enable you to ask questions of anybody up here or direct your questions to me, and I can parcel them out appropriately amongst the panel. This gentleman here. Do we have a microphone? If you just wait 1 second for the microphone to come find you, which is happening now. Hang on 1 second. Here she comes. So everybody can hear you. Thank you.
My name is Dave Dressler, and I'm addressing this generally. Admiral Fallon has resigned or been kicked out. What I know mostly, since I don't read Esquire, what I know mostly about Admiral Fallon comes from the Washington Post. But what I do know, he seems more in accord with my views of the approach we should take there. This obviously would seem to be a rejection of his views and would seem to indicate that we, powers to be, the president, vice president, whomever, want to take a hard line on Iran rather than a line toward negotiating, and maybe even, of course, there's speculation of a airstrike on Iran's nuclear centers or presumed nuclear center before Bush and Cheney leave office. I would like to hear members of the panel comment on this situation.
Scott, maybe you can begin with the Washington policy question here, and then maybe Anthony, you can talk a little bit more about Iran's role in the region.
Yes, as you outlined, it does seem that Admiral Fallon's resignation does have to do both with differences over approach to Iran, which he has been pretty public about for the past year. That he does not believe that the sort of aggressive tone and approach will have much effect on Iran abandoning whatever kind of nuclear program it is doing right now. There is also an element of Iraq policy there as well, that he very much favored a more rapid withdrawal of U.S. troops. He worries about the stresses on U.S. forces in the region, which he oversees entirely. And there's probably a bit of professional pique as well, in that he is General Petraeus's boss in fact, but in name, but in fact isn't. And those things probably came to a head in recent days as General Petraeus prepares to come back. There is coming from Jerusalem, where I spent the last 2.5 years, and where that very much a government in Israel that very much views Iran as one of the only existential threat, as it calls it, to its existence that's still around. It does not see the Palestinians in that light. There is a great deal of concern. There's a great deal of concern about Iran's intentions, but there is also a sense that Israel will act against Iran on its own if the Americans don't. And I doubt very much that the Americans want that to happen also. A unilateral Israeli response to that would inflame the region, that I'll let Anthony discuss more, but in ways that are pretty unimaginable right now. There'd be 10,000 missiles in the Galilee within about 20 minutes. So that's sort of the broad outline of I think what took place here, but it certainly raises questions about the direction of the next 7 or 8 months and this administration's intentions toward Iran before it leaves office.
It's remarkable. I think Lebanon's actually a great place to watch this kind of Iranian-American Cold War that's been going on for more than a year now. I mean, it being fought Iraq, Palestine, and Lebanon, basically. My sense has always been that war is kind of a substitute for an escalation at this point, to kind of see how this plays out. But I think we're seeing it in very clear-cut terms in Lebanon, that both countries see a battle that can be won or lost. There, the U.S. is coal off the shore of Lebanon for a little while. The Saudis trying to pull out everyone out of Lebanon, pulling their nationals out of Lebanon. Virtually every conversation you have in this point is that there's going to be a renewal of war between Israel and Hezbollah. People talk weeks. An ambassador of a key Gulf country, said to me that he thought 2 or 3 weeks there was going to be a renewal of clashes. I think, again, this is a manifestation of this broader conflict that we're talking about between the United States and Iran. We may have been able to shed a little bit more light on the situation in southern Iraq, but I think what you're seeing right now with this kind of Iranian-Syrian axis in the Middle East is they're just willing to wait. It's very clear that they're not going to there's not going to be any decisive step in any direction at this point on their part before this administration is over. They think they can get through this. It's not that many months left, and then they can see what the next administration brings. They may be overplaying their hand a little bit, but I think what we'll see in Lebanon, for instance, where it's been stuck in a crisis since basically the war in 2006, the deepest political crisis since its civil war, is stalemate. Nothing's going to happen there until this administration is over. So, I think it depends. I think really, in some ways, the initiative is going to be on the part of the Americans, what we're going to see in the region in terms of which direction this crisis goes.
Hamid, what do the American commanders on the ground see in terms of Iran's hidden participation and things there?
Well, in terms of clash between Americans and Iran, it's going on every day in Iraq. On the surface, it's clear that it's going on in terms of fighting for influence and for economic, cultural, and political influence. A few days before I left Baghdad, the president of Iran came on an official state visit to Iraq. He got red carpet treatment. He met with all the top officials. Some of the officials were practically fawning over themselves to praise him. It was really quite extraordinary the way that he was treated, and a lot of people explicitly were comparing that treatment to when President Bush comes to visit Iraq. He comes in with no prior announcement for very brief visits, stealthy visits, and then leaves because of security considerations. On the other hand, Ahmadinejad was very open in driving through Baghdad and visiting a lot of people. So a lot of people saw that as a sign of the rising influence and the success in terms of cultural and political clout in Iraq. In terms of the fighting going on militarily between America and Iran, that's a little bit harder to pin down, but the Americans certainly accuse Iran of supporting armed groups there. A lot of the fighting that's gone on between what the Americans now call euphemistically the special groups, which is what they can call the Shiite militias that they consider to be supported by Iran, that's been sort of on the wax, and then there have been increases and dips, and it's very difficult to gauge exactly what Iran's influence there is. The Americans say it's been significant, and after a period of time where they said the Iranian involvement in allowing weapons to come across the border had dipped, they're now saying that it's risen again. That's very, very difficult for independent observers to gauge. We've been shown repeatedly examples of weapons and bombs that the American military said it's clear that they came from Iran, but for security reasons they can't explain to us exactly how they know that to be. So independently it's difficult to tell. But we can speak clearly about those political and cultural influences, and economically, there's tremendous influence, especially in the South. When I went to Basra and spoke with officials there, even Western diplomats there, many of them were grumbling and saying that they've been thwarted in their efforts to try and get Western and support from Sunni Arab countries to support Iraq, but that Iran has been very, very aggressive in setting up conferences, in providing support, and all that. And if you consider Iraq to sort of be one of the proxy fronts between Iran and Iraq, between Iran and the United States, at least on those non-military fronts, I think a lot of Iraqis would say that Iran is winning that fight.
Pam, you have anything to add?
No, I think we've done enough on that.
Okay. Other questions on this side? Is there a student? Are you a student? No, okay. We'll go down in front then first. You can bring the microphone over. You look young enough to be a student.
Hi, I'm Asha, and this question is for Anthony Shadid. I noticed that you wrote a lot of stories on women and children and their struggle living in Iraq. For example, the story of Amal living in Iraq and her struggle. Why do you choose to write about the women and children?
It's interesting. It was almost kind of by accident. Phil Bennett, who's now the managing editor of the paper, was the foreign editor back then, and when I got to Iraq, it was the beginning of the invasion, and I remember the second or third day of writing about bombing, I realized I was writing the same story over and over. And at the bottom of the story, I'd spent time in the streets, at restaurants or cafes, and I remember talking to ordinary people, and I would put the last 7 or 8 paragraphs of the story was kind of the conversations I had. I remember I thought Phil made a very brilliant observation. He said, this is the most interesting part of the story. This is what we should be writing about during this war. And I think it evolved over time. I thought it was most compelling to me as well that if we can treat war as a backdrop to a very human story in a way, I think the reporting can be more compelling, the storytelling can be more compelling. I think we can relate to readers in a much more serious fashion. You know, I'm going to be kind of blunt here. I think there's a certain dehumanization that's gone on about the Arab world over the past generation. And when I sat down to write stories during that invasion about Karima and her daughters, for instance, and I followed them for a long time and still remain in touch with them, I realized that if I tried to write just about Iraqis, well, I don't know how much that's going to relate to readers. But if I write about a mother sending her son off to fight, or a father losing his daughter in a bombing, I think we can relate to that. I think these are universal emotions, universal sentiments, and I think that was the ambition of that reporting and of those stories.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay. And in the article about Amal, you quoted her last diary entry saying Baghdad has fallen to the Americans. What did that quote mean to you?
That's interesting. That did mean a lot to me, actually. I remember sitting there. I don't think I wrote this in Night Draws Near, but I do remember thinking that when I read that, it was something that I felt a little bit. That it didn't matter to me that Saddam Hussein had fallen on that last day. I forget the date now, in April of 2003. But it was that Baghdad does mean something more, I think, in the Middle East. Even the word in Arabic, Baghdad, it has a certain resonance that I think we maybe miss sometimes in the West. It wasn't Riyadh, it wasn't Doha, it wasn't Dubai. This was Baghdad, one of the great capitals of the Arab world. Whatever we thought of Saddam Hussein, whatever we thought of modern Iraqi politics, its fall to a foreign power meant something. And I think it meant something in a deeper sense, a deeper cultural sense. And that's why I was so struck by her quote that she seemed to be saying the same thing when she wrote that in her diary.
I'm so sorry. This is my last question. And this is for all of you, the panelists. Okay. How do you think the U.S. foreign policy can help the Middle East?
We'll just ask one panelist to answer that, and it's Pam's turn.
Oh, dear. Thank you. Well, I'd like to pick up on Anthony's theme of the humanization. And I said a little bit when I was speaking about how I think it's really important for us in the West to not look at people in the Middle East as the devil, to not look at them as the enemy, and to not demonize them, to really look at them as human beings and as individuals, and to try and differentiate the best we can from those who are actually harmful to our interests and those who are not. Lots of people don't know that there's a difference between Arabs and non-Arabs. I mean, I work a lot in a place like Afghanistan. There are no Arabs in Afghanistan, maybe 1 or 2 hiding along the border somewhere, but they have very little in common with Arabs, and they will tell you in a heartbeat that they feel very differently, that they're different. They have different history, different pride, different culture. They're very proud of their culture. One of the things that's always said about people in Afghanistan, for example, is that they have 2 great qualities. One, they're incredibly hospitable, and the other, they're incredibly vengeful. So if you get on their good side, you're in luck, and if you're on their bad side, you better watch out. That's pretty much a code for a way of life. I was really struck by, I didn't have a chance to mention it in my remarks, there was a public opinion survey done by some very professional groups in this country about 2 months ago in Pakistan. And they interviewed, I don't know, many hundreds of people in not only, in cities, all kinds of different people. And they were asked, about their views of the West, of the United States, of foreign policy, and of, one of the questions was, what do you think is the greatest threat to your country's stability and safety? And they were given sort of 10 choices. The number 1 choice was the United States military. Way, way down at the bottom was Al-Qaeda. And there is this perception in many parts of the Middle East. Everywhere I go, everywhere all of us go, time after time, we're in the position of, in a sense, representing the West to the places and the people that we meet. And we try very hard to explain to them, no, we do not want to destroy your religion. No, we're not embarked on a crusade against Islam. We are responding to attacks that have happened to us and to our interests. But many, many people in that part of the world simply don't believe it. They really think we're trying to destroy them. And anything we can do to dispel that notion, I think, is extremely important.
I hope you're going into journalism. Those are good
of anti-Americanism in any of the countries you cover?
Well, Pam just addressed that in part. Scott, you want to talk about that since you bridged a couple continents here?
Well, speaking from my last assignment, you had two different. In the city I lived in, you could cross a boundary and find very different sentiments toward the United States. On the Israeli side in West Jerusalem, you had we're all in this together kind of spirit, Israelis and Americans, against a lot of the elements that Pam just described, a sense of siege by Islam, by Arabs. And you also had, and then crossing over into East Jerusalem, you had very much a feeling that the United States was not playing fair in this conflict, hadn't for a long time. But what was most interesting to me about the Palestinians, this is a population that for a long time looked to the United States with a lot of hope. There is a very large Palestinian diaspora in the United States. Almost anywhere you went, you'd ask Palestinians where their families are, and they're in Chicago and Los Angeles and New York. But the rise in anti-Americanism in the Palestinian territories, you could chart even during my 2.5 years there. And part of that has to do, back to your question about what American foreign policy can mean in the Middle East, how it can improve the Middle East. And one is quite simply to make sure that when it promotes a policy, it follows through with what that policy says. If the idea is to remake the Middle East through democracy, then be ready for what democracy brings. And one of the chief points of the sore points among Palestinians was, of course, you favor democracy, they have elections, they elect Hamas, the team that the Americans and the Israelis did not want elected, and the government is boycotted and all money is shut off. That did not seem like a logical response to Palestinians, even Palestinians who were very much opposed to Hamas and its brand of Islamist government. And so in Latin America now, I think I touched on a little bit in those earlier remarks, but this recent tension between Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia very much pivoted on anti-Americanism. It was largely a proxy debate for America in that part of the world and its influences. And Colombians think very highly of the United States. But you see a real rise across the rest of the South American continent that America is out of touch, and it's not what it used to be. Obviously, particularly among the left, but it's a shared sentiment, and a lot of that has to do with U.S. policy towards the Middle East. In fact,
on this side, back to the gentleman in the blue shirt, there.
The vote on Kirkuk has been postponed, and now it's going to go, June 30th. And I was curious as to anyone's, response or coverage or anything they've heard on the situation there. Has it improved? Has they figured out a better means to divide the city or whatever? And also just a personal comment. It seems to me, as a person watching the situation, that the Kurds are almost paralleling the story of the Hmong in Vietnam, where they're pretty much getting sold out. So just a personal comment.
Hamid?
Well, two interesting points. To go to the latter one first, it's interesting you mentioned that about the Kurds, particularly with the Turkish incursion into northern Iraq, which a lot of Kurds felt precisely that way. It was a very difficult situation for the United States. For those of you who weren't following this, there's a decades-long struggle between a Kurdish separatist group known as the PKK and Turkey. This Kurdish group wants to form a Kurdish homeland across a number of countries, including Turkey, and Turkey and the United States label them a terrorist group and have been fighting them. And a lot of the PKK is based in northern Iraq in an area that's essentially a semi-autonomous, region, essentially its own country in Kurdistan, and PKK have been hiding there. Turkey and others might say not hiding there, operating there with the blessing of Kurdistan. But in any case, Turkey made a land incursion into there a few weeks ago, and in a lot of places, this was a huge shock to a lot of people. This was the border between Iraq and Turkey crossed into a sovereign country, and a lot of Iraqis were very upset. The Kurds have been very strong allies of the United States, and Turkey is obviously a crucial ally of the United States in the region. So this really put the United States between two of its key allies, and many Kurds thought that essentially the United States sided with Turkey. There were a lot of comments made, especially at the beginning, by United States officials that said every country has the right to go after terrorists, and we consider the PKK terrorists, and therefore we understand what Turkey is doing. And for the Kurds who really felt like they have developed essentially their own homeland in the north with the blessing of the United States and trying to get support, they couldn't understand why the United States was allowing this to happen. On the other hand, a lot of people in Iraq are very angry at the Kurds. The Kurds have on a number of issues have made plays for more control over the issue of oil, over the issue of Kirkuk, as you mentioned. The Constitution called for referendum to occur by the end of last year, which did not occur. It's been postponed. I think it's really now anyone's guess when that's going to happen. As is the issue of elections in general. When we talk about promoting democracy, obviously elections are a key, if not the key component to creating a democracy in any country, and yet Iraq has not seen provincial elections since 2005. There was a law passed this year to great fanfare and to great acclaim that would have created elections by October. That law was unexpectedly vetoed by the Presidency Council, and now it's a bit of an open question whether those provincial elections will take place, never mind Kirkuk in the specific. So like a lot of things in Iraq, this is one of those cases where something happened, this law was passed that would call for elections, and there was great excitement for the United States. There were statements that this really shows that political reconciliation is taking place, things are moving forward, and Parliament can pass things. And then when people began to look at the fine print, and after a few days of discussion, it seemed like something very different. Some people might say that's a sign that nothing is going to work in Iraq and that they're hopelessly engaged in political stalemate. Other people will look at that and say, well, it's not too different than our own Congress, which can't get anything done either. So it sort of depends on your perspective on things. But for the elections, I think it's now really anyone's guess when they're going to take place.
On this side. Let's go towards the back. The lady right in the back. Please.
Okay. Is there an apparent Sunni-Shia divide in Iraq right now? And I have one other question, because she got three. No, I'm kidding. How is the relationship between Ahmadinejad and Chavez affecting South American politics right now?
Okay, I guess Amit goes first and Scott second.
Is there a divide between the Sunni and the Shia?
Better or worse?
That's interesting. Sure. Well, that's interesting, and I'd be interested in Anthony's experiences. The beginning of the war, when I arrived in 2006, is when it was right after. In 2006 was when it began to get really, really bad, and obviously we're writing a lot of stories about that Gulf and comparing it to before Saddam Hussein, before the American invasion, at which point. there was intermarriage between Sunni and Shia. There were a lot of underlying tensions, but that there were relations, and it was considered in a lot of places impolite or just not allowed to ask about what sect they were part of. That began to change a lot, obviously, and obviously there continue to be huge confrontations, decisions, everything in Iraq based on sect. At the same time, you hear from a lot of people saying, when you ask them, as we often do for stories, the normal questions you would ask anyone in the world: what's your name, how old are you, where are you from? And we often ask what sect they're from. And a lot of people resent that and refuse to answer, and they say, well, I'm an Iraqi. And so on the one hand, you might say, well, that's a sign that the sectarian divide doesn't exist, and people want to say they're Iraqi, they don't want to say they're Sunni or Shia. On the other hand, some of those people who refuse to answer that question and say they're Iraqi I've had people say that who are reputed to be some of the most sectarian people, accused of killing and ordering the deaths and kidnappings of people of the opposite sect. So a lot of people pay lip service, and a lot of people want to say this was something created by the media and created by the United States government. And I think in some cases there is some truth to that, particularly some decisions made by the American government that exacerbated those tensions. But despite some of that attempt, I think, to not want to acknowledge that gulf that exists, especially on some people, it's very painful that there is now this huge, open, divisive, violent, horrific tension between the two sects when it didn't exist in some cases on the surface before. I think there's some desire to perhaps to explain that away. It didn't come from us; it came from outside. And as I said, in some cases it did, but I think it's undeniable that there is a very strong and real and dangerous division between the sects right now in Iraq.
Anthony, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me. I mean, I think Amit is right. When you go back to Baghdad before the war, when I was there in '98 and 2002, it really was a very rude question to ask. And the only people to ask it would be Americans, if you're Sunni or Shia. I think, I tell you, I resisted this notion, and I think what you're saying is an interesting point when you're in the West Bank. And I think when you talk to Palestinians, I mean, there are no Shiite Palestinians. When you're in a place like Jordan or Egypt, there is this notion, we always identify ourselves as Muslim. I mean, the idea of being Sunni or Shia just never even entered into our conversations back then, and they're right, it didn't. And I remember when I started hearing about this, like the extent to this kind of the growth of the sectarian divide in Lebanon back in 2005, I myself was dismissive of it. And now I've kind of come to the conclusion what I was trying to say a little bit earlier is that it has gathered a momentum of its own. And I agree with Amit. I think there has been a manipulation of it, a very clear-cut manipulation. I think this administration has manipulated to a certain extent to blunt Iranian ambitions in the Arab world. I think they saw the ascent of Nasrallah, they saw the ascent of Hezbollah in the wake of the 2006 war, and I think there's been an attempt to blunt it by appealing to a very base, I think, certain Sunni chauvinism as a way to stop that. I think when we look at Iraq, we can look at the CPA policies back in 2003. I think we can look at the agendas of the former Iraqi exile parties, and we can see a certain manipulation of sectarian divisions as a way to empower their own agendas. But as Amit said, and I agree with him, it has gained a momentum of its own at this point, and it is reshaping politics in the Arab world. I think the best example of this, or the best evidence of this, is that it's hard to find any kind of political organization or political party in the Middle East, in the Arab world at this point, that does not revolve around a sectarian or ethnic axis. In other words, it can only organize itself on sectarian or ethnic terms, and I think this is something that defies the past in a lot of ways. There are no more secular parties in the true sense of the word.
Scott, you want to answer the Chavez question?
Yeah, I'll just add one small thing on this. It's interesting that Palestinians are telling you, I'm not sure what Palestinians you were telling me about, but you recall when the Hamas-Fatah fighting, Fatah's the secular nationalist party, when they were fighting in Gaza in last June, the Fatah response to Hamas armed guys walking through the streets or Hamas leadership was cheering Shiite, 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 Shiite. because of their backing from Iran. And so, Sunnis like to say everything was fine before the Americans got there, but they also exploit this stuff pretty dramatically. Even King Abdullah of Jordan was emphasizes at every chance he gets that there is a Shiite crescent growing throughout the Middle East that threatens Arab Sunni governments allied with the United States. So it's a game that's played by both sides, and the Palestinians, while there are no Shiite Palestinians, they have used that. The secular nationalist Fatah guys have used it very much against Hamas. As far as Chavez and Ahmadinejad go, it's more what these guys have going for them besides a pretty kind of some appealing, glib, populist rhetoric on a lot of issues is they have a lot of money. And they can get together and they can go to a place like Bolivia where the president, Evo Morales, is kind of is one of them. And when he's trying to sell off companies, public enterprises to make some money for some of his populist projects, Iran's happy to put up some money for it. And so tangibly what they have going for them is traditional revolutionary populist discourse and a lot of oil money. And that can go a long way in some of these poor countries. But I won't go so far as to say that it's reshaping anything that dramatically at this point. But as two leading members of OPEC, they have some clout and they can make some things happen.
This side now. Down in front here, this side here.
How can journalists do a better job of maybe presenting the story of American foreign aid, reframing it somehow, and I guess I'm addressing this to Tony. When you took your reporting on Iraq and used the war as a backdrop and brought the human story forward, is there a way the press, or why doesn't the press, better educate the American public in terms of American foreign aid? And I'm speaking specifically of the Middle East crisis, meaning Palestine, Israel, when almost half of the American foreign aid budget goes to Israel, while you've got children living in squalor that cannot even go to school. So their future is non-existent because they'll hit 18 years old with no schooling and no possibility of a future. How can American journalism, or why does American journalism not better educate the American public on what fuels the Middle East crisis, our responsibility in that role?
Anthony, you want to talk about that?
Scott might be the better person to talk to on aid, aid in Israel and Palestine. I think it's an interesting point, though, about understanding American aid and how it's deployed in the Middle East in a way. And Egypt, I think, is the greatest example of that, understanding the scope of the American investment. It's far greater than the Marshall Plan. If in equivalent dollars, what's been invested in Egypt since Camp David. And what we see, and I'll tell you, it was the first story that I did when I was a correspondent in Cairo. This is 12 years ago. I probably should revisit it, but but I always found it is Egypt, when you look at opinion polls, for instance, what how they view the United States at this point. Egyptians are almost overwhelmingly some of the most upset at U.S. policy in the Arab world, and here is one of our greatest investments in the region. So I think trying to appreciate the contradictions of foreign aid, the implications and the impact of foreign aid. I think you're right. I personally haven't done a good enough job on it, in covering the Middle East. I think it's a complicated story. It's not an excuse not to do it, but I think you're exactly right. It should be done probably in a more systematic fashion.
I'd agree with all of that, and I'd say that we do write quite a bit about it, and it's just the way to frame it so that it becomes part of the larger story of what's happening there. And there are times when I can think of being successful, and times that I know that I was not in making this stuff clear. There is a huge imbalance between the $3 billion a year that the United States sends to Israel, mostly for military equipment, and the roughly $500 million that it sends to the Palestinian territories. I don't say the Palestinian Authority because that's not where it goes. It goes through NGOs largely. The USAID program in much of the Middle East is an advertising program for the United States. They build big things they can put signs on, and they are not always the most useful things to people living there. And that has changed really in the last 6 years, and it's not personal opinion. I've spent a lot of time with USAID workers in the region who are very frustrated with this. That feel that they could make a much greater difference in people's lives doing projects that are much less showy. So it's a very good question. It's a very tricky thing to write about beyond mentioning numbers in a story. You hope people can pull from that something that says, wow, there's a big difference here. But it's tough, and it's one of those things that we're a daily newspaper. We got a shot at it every day, and we just have to do better at it.
Pam, a lot of money's gone, aid money's gone to Afghanistan. Where's it gone?
I was hoping you'd ask. What I've seen in Afghanistan is a real disconnect between the amount of money that's gone and the perception of the aid that's arrived. You ask any Afghan outside the capital if that person has seen any benefits of international aid, because they don't distinguish between American and other countries, and they'll say no. Or they'll say, well, we see the soldiers, we see the troops, but our lives have not changed. So I've often gone out with, for example, and this speaks a little bit to another question that was raised, go out with military convoys, and they're bringing aid to villages, and they're hoping that this is going to help them get more information, for example, about where the Taliban are hiding or where the bad guys are hiding. But it turns out they're bringing all the wrong things because nobody checked in advance and found out what people really wanted. And I guess what I want to say is that this is not really about our coverage. It's really more about aid and what happens to it. I think it's really important for us to ask what it is that people really want, rather than imagining it and then sort of building a big structure and then presenting it. People do not want buildings. They want, in Afghanistan, where mothers die in childbirth more frequently than in almost any other place in the world, people don't want hospitals. They want midwives on donkeys going out to the far reaches. And there are things they want that are hard to accept. They would rather have a new mosque than a new school in their village. Is it our choice? Do we say, "But no, we have to build a school"? If we can't, we're not in the business of mosques. Drug trafficking is a huge problem now in Afghanistan. A lot of people there think, and it's my opinion too, that law enforcement is the key to stopping the drug trafficking. But instead, you have tons of aid, very well-meaning aid, going to projects that cannot work, such as planting eggplants and tomatoes, where any sane, logical person who is a small farmer will grow opium poppies. So this is not to criticize the intention, but often you do find there's this huge disconnect between what we think we are doing to help and what actually does get on the ground and what people perceive as happening.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, one from each side, so we'll start over here. The lady in red in the middle there. That's you. Microphone's coming.
Some of you addressed this a little bit, but can you expand a little bit on international perception, how closely the world is watching the U.S. elections, and what, if any, your respective regions have at stake in the changing administration?
Let me just start by saying the world is watching these elections amazingly closely. It is huge news everywhere around the world. And for instance, in Britain, I talked to my friends there. It's pretty much pushed the British government entirely off the front pages, which I thought would be good for the Prime Minister. But they say, well, it just shows how dull he is. But they're really, really interested in what's going on here. And part of it is just the drama of it, obviously, the horse race drama, which in many places in the world you don't find. You don't find this kind of open contest. It must be amazing in many countries of the world to see what's going on between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, which simply wouldn't happen in most countries in the world. But how the elections will affect these different places, Pam?
I think Pakistan is a really good example of a place where people are watching very, very closely. Barack Obama has said on several occasions that he would go with the U.S. military into Pakistan in chasing down the al-Qaeda terrorists. And Pakistan is a country that, for all its problems, it feels very strongly about the issue of national sovereignty. They do not want us there. And so I don't know, what the different candidates, I don't know what, say, Hillary would do, for example. I mean, I think McCain clearly would probably have a more muscular military policy, perhaps, than a Democratic president. But, we're going to have to face some really tough problems there because, somebody needs to go after these guys. And the Pakistanis don't seem to be able to, but they are very, I would venture to say that 99% of the Pakistani people do not want us going in there. So it's a big problem.
McCain says he'll stay in Iraq 100 years if necessary, or was it 1,000? I can't remember. And both Democratic candidates say they'll get out tomorrow. Do the Iraqis believe any of this?
Well, I think that the Iraqi government officials are following this very closely in interviews over the past few months. Whenever we met with any top officials, they would always ask, what do you think of Hillary? What do you think of Obama? What do you think of McCain? And I would say for the most part, they tended to support McCain more, actually, the ones in power, in part perhaps for the policy, but also remember that as part of the Democratic criticism of the Bush administration policy in Iraq, many have been criticizing the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's government. Many have said very critical things about some of them, calling for some of them to resign. So there already is some bad blood between some of those officials and in particular Senator Clinton from the past few conversations I had with people. So it'd be interesting if she does win, what sort of relationship she would forge with some of the people she criticized. But what I think is interesting is actually how little people on the street were talking about this. Perhaps it's because it hasn't entered the general election phase yet, but we are so focused on it here and people across the world, and yet in Iraq, when you talk to people on the street, many of them were not following the election very closely at all. And I in particular thought this was interesting because I thought people would be following Barack Obama more closely, and that just isn't the case yet. I don't know if that will change. I don't know if that's because they have bigger things to worry about, and obviously they do have very significant things to worry about in Iraq. But I was pretty struck by that.
The rest of the world, Scott?
I would just say that I spoke with an ambassador from a Southeast Asian country the other day, and this person said that the region was just transfixed by the election, just absolutely compelling. And as Len said, the horse race aspect of it and everything, but there was a sense that the Americans just weren't to be trusted with it, that they just wish they had a vote. So that's...
One last question. Let's see, I'll pick a student again this time. Here we go.
Hi, I'm Taylor Dankmeyer from West Potomac High School. And just on the issue of the last two questions with the disconnect between money given and helping the people, and also about the elections being important. How do you justify to the American people spending all this money abroad when we have our own issues at home? I guess that's with the economy possibly in recession, healthcare, and all that.
I guess I'll answer that question. First of all, none of us are from the editorial page, so we don't have opinions about things like that. We really don't. There's a complete separation between our editorial page, which is run by Fred Hyatt, the editor of the editorial page, and the rest of our newsroom, which is run by me. And I have nothing to do with our editorials. They have nothing to do with our coverage. But the factual response to what you said is that foreign aid still remains a teeny tiny part of the American budget. It's not really taking money away from anything domestically. Many other countries have much larger foreign aid budgets in comparison to their national wealth and in comparison to their government budgets than we do. And in fact, often Americans are widely criticized for that around the world, for not being more generous to the rest of the world. If you're looking for disparities in the American budget, the big items are defense and how you feel about that spending versus other spending, and then the entitlement programs, which are not only taking up a larger part of the budget all the time, but raise questions about how they're going to be financed in the future as some of us get older. And then lastly, it's servicing the debt. As the debt grows larger, more and more of the federal government is actually spent on paying interest, which a lot of people don't pay attention to, which is why for some politicians the size of the debt it remains an issue, even though many Americans don't pay attention to it. Thank you very, very much. You had very good questions.